Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, colleagues. This is Balakrishna Pisapati from the United Nations Environment Program, organizer of this webinar. We will wait for a couple of more minutes as colleagues are joining the webinar. So please be patient, hold on, and we will start the webinar in a couple of minutes. Thank you. Good morning, Patricia. You're muted.
Oh, it has unmuted.
Okay.
It has unmuted.
Good, thank you. Good. Okay, I think we are ready to start. Colleagues are joining still. Participants are trickling in. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, colleagues. Welcome to the webinar on issues of synthetic biology. Thank you for your interest and time for joining us today. This is a first in a series of webinars the United Nations Environment Programme, along with a few of the partners, are organizing in support of enhancing our understanding on the science and the policy interface issues related to synthetic biology. I'm very grateful to you for joining this webinar. This webinar is being recorded, but we'll also be making the presentations from the panelists and a short summary of this webinar after the webinar is over. Of course, a lot of you who have joined the webinar are either working on issues of synthetic biology, the science part of it, or the industrial applications. Have been working on the issue of regulatory and policy issues for quite a long time. But of course, the interest in synthetic biology, the kind of investments that has gone into synthetic biology in the last couple of years has been astonishing. And in preparation for the webinar, I was just trying to update myself on where we stand with respect to the science and the industrial perspectives of progress or achievements in synthetic biology in the last year or so. I was quite surprised to note that just during the third quarter of 2021, we have seen an investment of close to $6.1 billion in synthetic biology. So that in 2021 as a year put together brings the numbers to $15 billion of investments in synthetic biology. And of course, the developments, the COVID pandemic, the mRNA-related vaccines, and a lot of research that has gone into making use of synthetic biology-based applications has started to really peak. At the same time, what we have also seen in the last couple of years is that the focus on development of products in synthetic biology is now slowly moving to development of organisms based on synthetic biology. Of course, it has been there for long, but we've seen a big push in terms of the research, development, and applications of synthetic biology organisms in the last year or so. And some of the numbers of investments are a clear testimony to this fact. But of course, a lot of such information also relates to one clear fact, that people who are working in industry, people who are working on the application and development of synthetic biology organisms are trying to make use of this technology in terms of enhancing our ability to deal with a lot of challenges that we face, whether it is related to health or whether it is related to environmental management or agricultural production improvements or all of it. So the focus has been how to minimize our inputs and how to maximize the benefits of using this technology. So that's on one hand with respect to the industry and the science applications of synthetic biology. But on the other hand, colleagues who actually are working on the issue of regulatory and policy aspects to understand how the science is evolving and the implications of science on whether it is the environmental aspects of it or the social aspects of it or the economic aspects of it, have been seized with this particular issue of how is that we should be addressing the entire science and applications of synthetic biology. And for those of you who follow the discussions under the United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity, the CBD, as we call it in short, countries have started discussing this aspect of the impacts of synthetic biology in the context of the convention since 2010. But it was in 2016 we have had some significant progress in terms of our discussions. And as we are speaking now and convened here during this particular webinar, many of you are aware that the Convention on Biological Diversity has already established an ad hoc technical expert group that has produced a number of reports in understanding the developments in synthetic biology, undertaking a foresight analysis, looking at horizon scanning of the technology and its applications, with an intention to come up with a number of decisions in 2022, when the 15th governing body of the Convention on Biological Diversity, the Conference of Parties to the Convention on Biological Diversity, will be meeting in August 2022. So certainly it's a very opportune moment for us to understand where we stand on the science policy interface issues related to synthetic biology. The interest of the United Nations Environment Programme to organize this webinar are twofold. First, 2022 also marks the 50th anniversary of UNEP, and on 3rd and 4th of March, we'll have a high-level event commemorating the 50th anniversary of UNEP in Nairobi, Kenya, where the focus will be on how we need to strengthen science policy interface as we move forward in addressing a number of environmental challenges. So in that context, the topic of synthetic biology is extremely timely and handy in terms of understanding the science policy interface as we are discussing the issues now. And the second interest of UNEP is also to support the Convention on Biological Diversity's preparatory processes as and when the 196 countries who are parties to the convention would be moving towards making certain decisions at the 15th meeting of the Conference of Parties in 2022. So with that twin objectives, we actually had carefully planned to organize this series of webinars. As you have noted, we have two webinars. The first one that we are organizing today will focus on the issue of science and industry, the recent developments, the expectations, the challenges, where we have four very distinguished panelists who will be speaking to us from the industry and science perspectives. And we'll have two respondents who will focus on the policy and regulatory aspects. The second webinar, which is scheduled for 8th of March, will focus on the policy and regulatory aspects, where we'll have panelists focus on the recent developments on science and regulatory aspects on synthetic biology, with two respondents from the industry and science. And the outcome of it, we are expecting to feed into the CBD processes, not only within the convention, but also into the other processes, whether discussions are happening at FAO or the World Health Organization, WIPO, and all different platforms. So that gives you a bit of a context for this particular webinar. And I'm very happy to introduce and welcome the Director of the Division of Law at the United Nations Environment Programme, Professor Dr. Patricia Mgote, who is with us to provide some welcome remarks on behalf of UNEP. Over to you, Patricia.
Thank you very much, Bala. Distinguished participants, it is indeed my pleasure to welcome you to this convening, and I do appreciate that this is early, this is night, and we are all coming at different times, but it means that the topic is very important to us. UNEP is happy to convene the two events, the one today and the follow-up on 8th March 2022. And the focus on synthetic biology is imperative for us because it is a key and contentious topic within the ongoing discussions in the Convention on Biological Diversity. As Bala has said, we are at a critical juncture because the 15th meeting of the Conference of Parties to the Convention on Biological Diversity is expected to make decisions on policy and regulatory aspects related to synthetic biology during this year, 2022. And this will have implications on both global and national actions related to synthetic biology. There has been thus far very limited efforts to bring together academia, industry, and policymakers to one platform to discuss the science policy interface issues on synthetic biology. And the session today focuses on issues of science and industry, while the session on the 8th of March will focus on policy and regulatory issues. With a number of global experts, including from the Secretariat to the Convention on Biological Diversity, the webinars are expected to further the understanding of how science and investments are progressing. And this, one has to say, is a very dynamic space. UNEP is currently rolling out a number of programs in support of COP15 of the Convention on Biological Diversity, as well as adoption and implementation of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. These convenings are part of that effort. Synthetic biology is an emerging area of science that needs better understanding to make responsive policies. We hope that these webinars will enhance mutual understanding of synthetic biology related issues between academia, industry, and policymakers. The law division at UNEP is committed to working with a diverse array of stakeholders in the search for the best policy solutions to the problems we face as we deal with the triple planetary crisis of nature loss, climate change, and pollution. We recognize the importance of anchoring the policies in science broadly defined, and we will continue to support the strengthening of the science policy interface in the future. The meeting of UNEP at 50 is going to launch a process of working on these interventions in the science policy interface, and we hope that many of you will join us on this journey. I wish all the participants a great meeting. Thank you.
Thank you, Patricia. Thanks for your welcome remarks on behalf of UNEP. What I'd like to do is to very quickly introduce our distinguished panelists for today's event. As I mentioned, we have 4 panelists who will be speaking on behalf of academia and industry, followed by 2 colleagues who will be serving as respondents for this particular webinar. I'm very happy to introduce Dr. Mikhail Koepke, who is the Vice President of Synthetic Biology at Lanzatech. Welcome, Mikhail. Is a pioneer in synthetic biology, carbon fixing microbes, and is credited with the first person to produce a genetic blueprint for anaerobic gas fermenting microbes to help product development dealing with capturing the greenhouse gases. He has 100 patents to his credit. He is an awardee of the Presidential Green Chemistry Challenge in the United States and serves on the editorial board of Frontiers Microbes. So, Mikhail, over to you. Thank you. Mikhail, I think you are muted. Okay. You're okay, Mikhail.
Can everyone hear Michael? I'm not sure I can.
Yes, go ahead.
Excuse me, we seem to have lost you again. We can't hear you.
Is this better?
Yes. Go ahead, Mikhail.
Hello, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you, Mikhail. Go ahead.
Okay, I'm sorry for the technical
okay.
issues. Well, great. I'm not sure if you can see my slides, but I wanted to share some background of what we're doing at Lanzatech. So Lanzatech, and then dive into some of the policy and science issues that I see. So Lanzatech is a late-stage startup that is using biology to develop solutions to fight our climate crisis. We have developed a technology that is able to capture and use greenhouse gas emissions and greenhouse gases to replace fuels, and then also make chemicals, which at the end of their life, or everyday products, which at the end of their life we can recycle and bring back into the cycle, and essentially enable by that circular economy. At the heart of the technology is a microbial biocatalyst that is capable of converting CO2 and CO into useful products. And we can use a variety of input gases and feedstocks and produce a variety of products. We have scaled this process to industrial scale, operating 2 commercial plants in China, converting industrial emissions into ethanol. The process itself is essentially a fermentation process that is fully contained. You can see here some of those 500,000 liter tanks that we're using. And the microbes is an anaerobic microbe, so in presence of oxygen, it's unable to survive. So if it gets into the environment. We have developed a synthetic biology platform to essentially engineer this microbe to, instead of ethanol, also produce other products, for example, acetone or isopropanol that can be used in various applications, for example, plexiglass or building materials. And importantly, instead of current manufacturing processes that would release CO2 along the manufacturing of those chemicals, in our process we can lock in CO2 into the product. So instead of producing CO2, we can take CO2 out of the atmosphere through our process. And we've already demonstrated a range of different products, from recycled CO2, including jet fuel, packaging, home care, apparel, and already have several products in the market today. So for us, I think we're really kind of looking at globally rolling out that technology. So we have several commercial projects in the pipeline across the globe, in India, in Europe, in North America, in Japan, for example, that use a variety of different feedstocks. And essentially, we have the ability with our biology to then switch products which typical manufacturing plants wouldn't be able to do. So using a microbe that makes ethanol, and using a microbe that makes acetone, microbes that make isopropanol, for example. As you can imagine, I think working globally across those different jurisdictions, so I think we obviously operate at commercial scales. I think we're kind of the regulations in place. But those regulations differ from country to country, and it can take several months to import those microbes and then to get permits to use those microbes, even though we're talking about a contained process. And also for every variant of a strain, so for example, with a new gene to make a new product, I think we have to, this process needs to be repeated. So I think this is certainly something where we see an opportunity for streamlining, while certainly regulation is in place right now. It's also not just for the commercial deployment, but we also see that already at kind of the R&D work at the pilot scale. And in fact, Lanzatech started off in New Zealand, was founded there. But we meanwhile moved our R&D and headquarters to the US, which in fact in part was also due to the challenges of scaling up microbes in New Zealand with the policies in place. So the policies can really drive or block technologies. So I think in our view, it's really important to have a goal in mind with policies, to make policies that are very transparent and technology neutral. So in synthetic biology in particular, we see a lot of investment, as already mentioned, a lot of small startup companies. So I think it's really important to have clear policies in place that will allow those technologies to translate to the market before certainly things we've encountered was the first of our technology like ours. And likewise, I think it's really important to bring in a lot of different perspectives and viewpoints. I think there's certainly differences in policies. I think a lot of the policies are initially influenced from maybe working with multicellular organisms and then applied to for example, microbial processes, which are different. And I'm happy to expand on that a bit more ongoing. But I also want to kind of bring in different viewpoints. I think I've seen Frank Tate, for example, in the audience, and Sinbao Beta or Build with Biology supporting this event as a really good group, bio organization, as well as another group that has working with a lot of organizations and be really good to bring in. And another group I wanted to highlight is the Engineering Biology Research Consortium, which is a non-profit public-private partnership, which essentially is engaged in synthetic biology education. It's involved in security, in technical road mapping, as well as in policy and engagement, and actually having a global forum on engineering biology or synthetic biology that will be held later this year, and in its second event. One area where I am particularly involved with is the road mapping. I think at the moment we're developing a roadmap for synthetic biology for climate and sustainability applications. So I think looking at technologies and where synthetic biology can enable large-scale sequestration of greenhouse gases, combating climate change, conservation of ecosystems and biodiversity, and also looking at mitigation of climate effect. But it also has a section on social dimensions and policies, and certainly a call here for collaboration as well. I think we have several workshops that's already taken place, some more that will take place, and looking for really a broad range of inputs here as well. And lastly, I think I'm often asked about what is synthetic biology. So the EBRC has also a really good definition on their homepage that I really like. So I think essentially synthetic biology aims to make biology easier to engineer, and is a convergence of advances of chemistry, biology, computer science, and also engineering, which enables us to go from an idea to a product faster and cheaper. So certainly a kind of a lot of development coming together, but I think it's certainly based on advancements in genetic engineering and so on. And with that, certainly happy to expand on any areas and go more into details of interest.
Thank you, Mikhail. Do you have any points to add, Mikhail, before closing?
No, I think not for the moment, but happy to expand if there's questions. And
sure. Thanks a lot, and quite an interesting presentation that gives a very quick snapshot of where the technology is being applied and what kind of actions are currently underway. And certainly, if I have one or two takeaways from that presentation, the first one would be the number of countries where some of these technologies are being deployed and used at a commercial scale, as you said, Mikhail, but also the varying policy and the regulatory environment. So to a certain extent, when we are discussing some of it, we are aware that we are not starting from scratch, or we are not operating in a vacuum, but then there are many of these frameworks that are already available. And you mentioned about New Zealand and India, and we will have our colleague Tim Strabala from New Zealand, who will be joining us as a panelist for the next webinar, who will be also speaking about some of those issues. But one key point from your presentation that you mentioned was the streamlining aspect of it, which I'm sure that the discussions currently under the convention would try to focus on, is that how can we make the policy and regulatory environments more predictable, but at the same time more streamlined, which basically is the overarching interest or objective of the discussions under the convention. So thank you, Mikhail, and certainly hold on for questions and comments as we complete the presentations. We will take a number of questions from the participants. So thank you very much. So I'd now like to give the floor to our colleague, Nicole Richards, who is the Chief Executive Officer of Allonnia. She has 28 years of industry experience working in sectors like water, minerals, industrial applications, pharmaceuticals. She was also the former head of strategy and growth at DuPont, trained on environmental management issues, and currently focuses on a number of applications related to waste as a resource. And of course, Nicole will be focusing on the industrial aspects of it. Over to you, Nicole. Thank you very much for joining. No, Nicole, I think we are not able to hear you. Paxton, can you help? Just.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah, loud and clear. Go ahead.
Okay, excellent. I'm going to see if you can share my my presentation. I don't see that as an option. If not, I'll try. Are you able to share it?
Yeah, I think Luis will try to do it, but you go ahead. Luis,
Okay.
can you please?
Okay. Well, I'll start, and then hopefully you'll be able to see some slides in the background. But it's been 250 years since the start of the Industrial Revolution, and the advances that have been made have been profound, enabling a standard of living and global capabilities that we've not seen possible or have even imagined. By contrast, the impact on our planet has been devastating, with a long list of environmental consequences, including polluted land, water, and climate change. The good news is that nature is resilient and will always figure out a way to heal itself. The bad news is the damage done in 250 years will take thousands of years to undo. So at Allonnia, we see waste as a failure of the imagination. In nature, nothing is wasted because nature is the original innovator, recycling everything in a circular ecosystem. So our ethos at Allonnia is to work in harmony with nature, combining biology and technology. Oh, great, I see some slides coming up. Thank you for that. If you could go to the one that says waste is a failure of imagination, that would be great. So we're working in harmony with nature, combining biology and technology to fast forward time and bring nature's future solutions to the present day. Through this collaboration, we will unlock the potential in waste and enable a world where nothing is wasted. You could go to the next slide, please. And one more. Thank you. So I think this is a really exciting time to be having this conversation. The case for synthetic biology as a realistic solution for environmental challenges is strong, as the cost of sequencing has dramatically declined. So if you look at just 20 years ago, where the cost of sequencing per megabase was $10 million. So that was in 2001. So now here in 2021, last year, it was less than a penny. And I think that this really illustrates the fact that we can take this incredible technology and bring it to the environmental world at costs that make this technology a possibility. If you could go to the next slide, please. So this is a really busy slide, and I'm not going to go through it, but what I want to highlight here is that this cost decline that we're seeing in the ability to sequence DNA is part of an enabling factor that permit us to develop and deploy at scale powerful transformative biology solutions that really leapfrog mechanical and chemical systems to transform waste. Previous solutions relied on natural organisms, but today we have the ability to analyze nature and synthesize it for optimal results. And I think what's really interesting is in one of these timelines, you'll see that in 1971, the first genetically engineered organism was developed and deployed in situ, which is in the ground, for oil spill remediation. And this technology was patented in 1980. So we're setting the stage back in the 70s and 80s to take genetically engineered organisms for use in environmental applications. But we have not seen significant progress since then. And this is something that should and needs to change. So we really need to work with regulators and policyholders to be able to properly assess the risks and safeguards to unlock the full potential of this technology. And one more point on this, and I think this is super interesting too, is that we can learn how to do this safely through what's being done in nature today. So another very cool example of this is there's a natural organism that, you know, some of you may be familiar with, or if you're newer to the environmental remediation world, maybe you'll find this as fascinating as I do. But there's an organism called Dihalococoides, and this organism has naturally evolved to degrade halogenated compounds. So they break down these toxins into inert compounds. And what I think is very interesting about this is that when there are no toxins present, the halogenated compounds present in the vicinity of these organisms, they go into hibernation. So we can learn from nature on how to do this and how to do this in safe ways because it's being done today. So if you go to the next slide, please. And this is really a critical time to be having this conversation because mechanical solutions have reached their limits in a lot of cases. And we all know the trends that are driving the conversation that we're having today in the environmental world, and some of those are listed on here. But what is less known is the possibilities and the solutions that are possible. One other example I wanted to share, because I also think that this is really encouraging for all of us, is when we think of the problem of greenhouse gas and how do we sequester and capture carbon dioxide. What is possible is above ground mineral sequestration has the capacity of binding all the CO2 that could ever be generated. So, which is greater than 100,000 billion tons of carbon dioxide. So this is possible using what exists in our land today. And where synthetic biology comes into play is it helps accelerate what's already there and possible. So the solutions exist. We need to help develop them to the point where they can be effective from a time and a cost perspective. So if you go to the next slide, and Bella mentioned this earlier, and I find this fascinating. So 2020, I think it was, the synthetic biology market was estimated to be $6.4 billion. And probably you can have some varying figures, but around that. And the estimated growth rate of this is 28-ish% to grow to about $29 billion by 2026. And what we want to do in Allonnia is make sure that that growth is not just applied to really where it's focused today, which are things like vaccines and medical applications, but we need to keep pushing the boundaries of this technology beyond those fields to fields like the environmental fields. And where Allonnia is working today is really across 4 industries for this sector. And those are mining, energy, contaminants, and plastics. really all around breaking down contaminants using synthetic biology, or breaking down waste and being able to upcycle it. So if you go to the next slide, which is really my last slide. So we like to say that we're not reinventing nature, we're harnessing and collaborating with it so we can hit fast forward. And so what does this mean for progressing the technology, and how do we bring regulators and policyholders into this conversation? And I think it's really expanding beyond the boundaries of what we how we view synthetic biology. And there's varying ways that we can do this for these applications. There's things like directed evolution and how you can evolve existing organisms. You can take genetically engineered organisms, and that was the example I shared earlier with the oil remediation technology back in the 70s and 80s. And then you can go all the way to genetically modified organisms. So I think working together with innovators in industry and regulators to be able to safely bring this powerful technology into the problems that we have today. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicole. Thank you very much for your presentation and sharing some of those key points. And of course, you rightly mentioned, not just in terms of the costs of some of these technologies coming down significantly, but also the scope of applications, both in terms of products and organisms, which are really sort of having a significantly upward trend in the last couple of years. And of course, for those of the colleagues who follow this technology, now it's more like DIY kits, like do-it-yourself kind of kits that are available even for youngsters and kids to start working on using some of these applications of the technology. So certainly, it's a very interesting time, but it is also going to be an important time for people working on policy and regulatory aspects to an extent based on some of the points you mentioned. And I was just remembering a note that I read that is titled as "Carbon is not the enemy." But then we basically are moving from what we call as an extractive element to a regenerative element, because a lot of focus today, because of the emissions and because of the issues related to coal and climate change and all, are looking at the extractive elements of it. But there is such a big scope for looking at carbon as a regenerative element, which is all a part of life and life forms on this earth. So bridging the gap between the extractive and the regenerative is something which industry certainly is trying to look at, as I can sort of pick up from the various readings. But then the key point for people working on policy and regulatory aspects of it, or linking the science with policy development, is that how do we ensure that the safety, how do we ensure the applications of some of these products and organisms do not jeopardize anything that is already in nature. So it adds on. And you said that collaborating with nature. Yeah, certainly it's a very, very important point in moving forward. But I'm sure the interest of policymakers and regulators that there is that how do we maximize the benefits and minimize any negative consequences of some of this technology. So thank you very much, Nicole, and stand by for question and answers as we complete the panel discussion. So may we now move to the third panelist, Matias Cousin, who is the Managing Director of Life Sciences at Monitor Deloitte. Mathias, thank you very much, and we're very happy to also have Deloitte as a collaborator in organizing this particular webinar. So he's been working on issues of synthetic biology for long, and had advised and worked with a number of companies, private sector entities on cell and gene therapy. But more importantly, I'd worked in Africa, Europe, Americas, and China with a significant amount of experience, both in technology and also the regulatory aspects of it. Thanks, Mathias, for joining. You know, for all of you, it's quite late in where you are in Boston and parts of US. So thank you very much, and over to you, Mathias. Floor is yours.
Hey, hi everybody. And thank you, Balakrishna and UNEP for organizing this webinar. I think it's really important that we get together and have the opportunity to discuss. I think fantastic presentations so far. So I'll try not to repeat myself, not to say that, some of you might have stolen some of the things I was going to say, but, synthetic biology, is a field of incredible promise, as many of you have already mentioned. The way we define it is really about the design and construction of new biological parts, devices, systems, and the redesign of existing ones. And that's a definition from nature. And of course, the first field of application we've seen, what I would call synthetic biology 1.0, and where maybe most of the investment has gone so far, is in the field of human health in life sciences and healthcare. I'll talk a little bit about that, because I think there are some learnings that are interesting about that that we should consider. But imagine companies like BioNTech, Moderna, etc. They're all part of this interesting ecosystem. I think what everyone has noted thus far is, what's almost more important and interesting is the impact that this technology can have on climate and on changing, I think, the course, that the planet is taking, or that we are taking the planet towards, in terms of climate change. And so you can think about food and beverage, consumer products, and I think you all know some of the examples, of films, powered by synthetic biology, perfumes, or aromas, and silks that are all really engineered materials. Just one example here, and that will have a direct impact on in the next few years. I was talking to a startup company recently here in Boston, and they are developing DNA as a storage mechanism for data, for any type of data. And it turns out that DNA is a fantastic storage tool, and they plan to deploy it, for archival storage. That might be, many years away from a commercial application, but you can imagine the impact that this may have, and how costly some of these data centers can be, and frankly not great for the environment. And so very rich field. And when you look at some of the economic estimates that look at the growth of that field, some people will say it's between $2 and $4 trillion in the next 10 to 20 years. So it's a big number, and definitely one that speaks to the promise of the field. And of course, investors have responded in kind, and I would say it's a way to take biology risk without the sort of binary outcomes that you may get in life sciences sometimes. Learnings from the life sciences and healthcare ecosystem are actually very interesting. And for the better part of the last 5 to 10 years, we've been trying to scale cell and gene therapies, and it's been incredibly difficult. And a lot of the work has been actually on manufacturing, and a lot of the value and the difficulty has been on scaling manufacturing in a way that is economically feasible for the ecosystem. And that's been an issue in the US, that's been an issue in Europe, and in any other geography that's trying to put those therapies on the market. And so that's created a fairly interesting and rich ecosystem of companies and technologies that are really trying to innovate on manufacturing and scale manufacturing better, but also automate a lot of what is done today in the lab and in other and through computational tools and methods. So some very interesting things to think about. And one thing we set out, we did a little bit of research at Deloitte, was to see whether manufacturing was the same or held the same promise in life sciences as it does for the rest of the ecosystem or the other industries in which synthetic biology will have a role. And in fact, when we did that analysis, we realized that about half of the value is going to be in that sort of biochemical processing step. So definitely something there to think about, and really an opportunity, I think, for regulators around how do you scale, how do you support scaling of manufacturing of synthetic biology technologies to commercial scale in what's a fairly well established, obviously carbon-based value chain, and also across the globe, right? It shouldn't be just US, Europe, some of the usual suspects getting the investment. I think hopefully we're going to see a much broader and more equitable distribution of the wealth and investments here. And so for us, really clearly, a key opportunity is going to be that. Of course, it's going to require specific incentives. It's also going to require talent, investments to be made, and real definition of strategies for a lot of countries, to think about how they can attract that investment. And you can look at, for example, Eastman Chemicals that recently announced a circular economy investment in France. That's a $1 billion investment. That's a huge investment, and obviously very promising for the field, and hopefully something that can create even further economic ramifications for France in that case, and so something very, very interesting as well. All that to say is that as this happens, we think that we should see a dividend on climate, because if we're able to take some of these technologies, use biology to do things that were otherwise coming from essentially oil and gas extraction, then hopefully we'll see an impact on climate change and temperatures. And so one really exciting field for us is carbon sequestration technologies, and a lot of them, and I think Nicole, you highlighted many of them already, so I won't go into it, but are really close to I think being ready to being scaled, as far as I understand. And so I think in closing, maybe a few things. I think it's a field that's poised for incredible growth. I think if policy at the international level can create the sort of level playing field that helps the growth of those technologies, that would be incredible. I do think it's going to be difficult, and I'd love to hear perspectives on how do we make sure that happens in an environment where I think synthetic biology is going to be seen as part and parcel of industrial competitiveness for most economies. And so how can that happen? I think is something that preoccupies me, but also interests me greatly. I do think that, as we've seen in life sciences, you can have unintended consequences, and so I think there is, we talk about off-target cutting effects. Well, we have the potential here to influence, to change some ecosystems, and I think we need to be really mindful of that and really careful. But hopefully, a lot of the processes are going to be well controlled. And then, as I mentioned, talent, incentives, will be crucial to spur the further growth of the field. So let me stop there and maybe take any questions or comments.
Thank you very much, Mathias. Thanks for your reflections. Thanks for several of those key points you mentioned. But of course, if one is going to be looking at the technology as we read, the regular briefings that come out, and also thanks to networks like SynBioBeta, Build with Nature, the imagination is our limitation when it comes to this technology. Certainly there is so much of potential for applications, But 2 points which I'm sure is going to be very relevant for our discussions within the convention or other policy related components are the points that you raised. One is, how do we create a level playing field? And secondly, how do we distribute the investments? But certainly both of them are dependent on countries coming up with as clear policy frameworks, as clear frameworks to regulate in case if they want to regulate some of these technologies. And that is why from the discussions that are happening, whether it is under the convention or through other platforms, there is an absolute need for clarity in terms of understanding this technology. Many of us who work on this in this space recognize that we do have an operational definition for synthetic biology under the convention that was agreed to in 2016. But as we speak, we still do not have an agreed global definition for synthetic biology. So the discussions within the policy spaces range from focus on gene drives to gene editing to synthetic biology organisms and products. So certainly there is a need for a little more clarity. And that is where some of these kinds of discussions that bring the industry, that brings the academic experts who work on these technologies to have a face-to-face, to have a conversation with the policymakers make it so very, very important. So thanks a lot, Mathias, for your inputs. We'll have our next panelist, Ms. Felicity, Dr. Felicity Keiper, who is an expert in global regulatory affairs at BASF in Seeds and Traits Division based in Victoria in Australia. She actually brings in a very interesting experience. She's 20 years of experience working on issues of agricultural biotechnology, has also worked as a public sector expert with experience in public sector, focuses on international level aspects related to research and development and commercial applications of biotechnology. But more importantly, Felicity is one of our experts on this panel who very closely follows the discussions, both in terms of synthetic biology related issues within the convention, but also on issues related to access and benefit sharing, the digital sequence information related work under the convention. But today she's going to be bringing some of her perspectives from the plant science industry. Over to you, Felicity. Thank you.
Thank you, Balakrishna, for the introduction and for the invitation to participate. Are you hearing me okay? And can you see a slide with Global Industry Coalition at the top?
Perfect. Go ahead, please.
Okay, great. Just a very brief slide set from me. And this first slide is to provide some context for how and why the plant science industry is involved in synthetic biology, and I'm referring to the discussions under the Convention on Biological Diversity, but also under the protocols. And yeah, as Balakrishna indicated, my presentation will be a little bit different to my fellow panelists because we work in the development of biotech seed. And this is an LMO that is released into the environment. Seed is moved all around the world. And products derived from these crops are also moved around the world. So we are operating in a very complex regulatory landscape, which is directly connected to the Cartagena Protocol and obligations on parties to regulate biotechnology and potential adverse effects on the environment, and developments there can implement on our ability to operate. So we are a member of an industry association called CropLife International, and this hosts a group called the Global Industry Coalition, or the GIC. So through the GIC, so my company and companies with similar types of seed businesses, we've been engaged in work programs under the Cartagena Protocol since the beginning. So it was adopted in January 2000. And the GIC has a number of dedicated working groups for various regulatory related topics, and these are listed on the slide. And the major topic for the protocol is environmental risk assessment. And more recently, since about 2014, 2015, we have been engaged in the synthetic biology work programs under the convention. And another big area for the current intersessional period is the development of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, and we are engaged there because there's a target, includes a target that's relevant to synthetic biology. So the perspective that we have is that of a technology developer. So we develop biotech products that are intended for release into the open environment, and I'm sure you're all familiar with GM crops, genetically modified crops. And this is biotechnology that has been adopted around the world. These crops have been grown since the mid-1990s. So these have been engineered using transgenic technologies, also sometimes referred to as recombinant DNA technologies, especially in the language that's used in legislation and regulations. And this involves the insertion of one or more genes from an unrelated species to introduce one or more new traits. So, as I mentioned, these are within the regulatory scope of the Cartagena Protocol. So generally speaking, the convention requires its parties to regulate living modified organisms, or LMOs, developed using biotechnology, and the protocol, Cartagena Protocol, sets out procedures for doing that at national levels. And in practice, an LMO means the same thing as a GMO. So we have experience with the regulatory requirements of many countries, and when there are developments in the biotech regulatory discussions under the convention or the Cartagena Protocol, this can impact on policy developments in the countries where we're operating. So we're engaged in these treaty processes as a stakeholder who can contribute practical experience with regulation, its implementation, and how it impacts business. So as we know, there is no universally agreed definition of synthetic biology. And in our view, at least in our world, we've had a lot of discussion about this, trying to identify at what point there was such a change that necessitated a change in name from it being known as biotechnology previously. The term biotechnology is broadly defined in the convention. And then we have this new language of synthetic biology. But our view is that the term is sort of capturing an approach to engineering biological systems. So it's making, and that is an approach that's making use of decades of accumulated knowledge of biotechnology, of the tools, of biological systems, of genomes. It's also making use of continuously evolving biocomputing capabilities, and all of this is part of a continuum. It's not any one particular technology, tool, application, or organism. So an analogy could be the evolution of a smartphone. Every new model represents the state of the art in technological capability, but fundamentally it's still a smartphone. And returning to the synthetic biology discussions under the convention, we have an operational definition developed by the RTEG. I participated in these RTEGs under the CBD. It wasn't officially adopted, but it is used. It's considered a useful starting point for these discussions. And within these discussions, there are long lists of examples of specific technologies, applications, organisms, real and speculative, that are being debated for their potential impacts in connection to the objectives of the convention. And some of this is being presented as completely new and with questions around whether or not it's regulated or adequately regulated. And this is a bit, this discussion is a bit confusing because it is about many things. And it's, at least when it started out, it was in isolation of, it was overlooking the regulatory mechanisms that are already in place, the mechanisms that our industry is very, very much regulated by, and new products that we are developing remain regulated by. So cutting through all of that, a take-home message from there's been a decade of work on synthetic biology under the convention, is there is the conclusion that most living organisms resulting from synthetic biology approaches are LMOs. So this means they are within the scope of existing regulatory mechanisms. So those include the Cartagena Protocol and the national implementation of that in the Cartagena parties. So how does that affect us? The types of biotech seed products that we develop include GM crops, as I've mentioned, with a range of traits, and some of these are included in the synthetic biology discussions. Our industry is also developing crops using newer tools, such as genome editing or gene editing. For a GM crop, an example that is included in the discussions as a type of synthetic biology application is oilseed rape that produces omega-3 fatty acids. So this is referred to as metabolic engineering because several genes have been introduced to introduce a metabolic pathway that results in these enhanced levels of the omega-3. And this is actually a real product example. This exists and it's undergone regulatory assessment as a GM crop, and it's been approved in several countries. So this is actually regulated under the existing regulatory mechanisms. Genome editing or gene editing is an example of a tool or a collection of tools, enabling technologies that are included in these discussions. And there is a lot of debate about this because of the range of possible outcomes of genome editing. So the types of organisms that can be developed. And what's a bit confusing here, or a complicating factor here, is that there are ongoing discussions within many countries around genome editing regulation, a lot of regulatory reviews going on, regulatory reform activities to clarify the regulatory scope of these kinds of organisms, at least for plant breeding. And those discussions, they're generally not about adequacy of existing regulatory biotech regulation. It's more about whether or not the resulting organism is or is not an LMO, according to that how that country has defined LMO. So the take-home message there is that there are applications of genome editing that clearly result in LMOs, and these will be within the scope of existing regulatory mechanisms. And with that, I think I'm at or beyond my time, so I'll finish there, but I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Felicity. I think the last set of points that you mentioned actually are a very clear indication of the current status of discussions that are not just under the Convention on Biological Diversity on issues related to synthetic biology, but also at the national level. And you're right to say that several countries are still discussing whether there is a need to have a set of guidelines related to LMOs, GMOs, a separate set of guidelines related to gene editing, another set of guidelines related to synthetic biology products and organisms. So certainly the jury is out there. We still have not seen much of a consolidation of some of those discussions or ideas that are out there. But of course, in the context of the convention and the ongoing discussions under the convention, as I mentioned, that even though the term synthetic biology for the first time we heard in the parlance of the convention as early as 2010 during the Nagoya COP meeting, the Conference of Parties, the convention's meeting. But 2021-22, as we are discussing now, there are still a lot of questions that needs to be where parties or the countries need to be finding some answers. But of course, as I mentioned, that one of the reasons for UNEP to convene this kind of webinar, bringing in the policymakers and the scientists and the industry experts together, is essentially to, I wouldn't say bridge the gap, but to facilitate a better communication and better exchange of different ideas and the emergence of both the applications and the investments that are out there. And to an extent, we will hear more about some of these kinds of challenges or these kinds of issues that need clarity, both from our respondents, but also during the second webinar that we will do, or we will organize on the 8th of March, But having said that, now we have completed all the 4 experts making their points, and we would like to open the floor for any questions or comments from the participants, and then we will have the 2 respondents who will also be reflecting on not just the presentations, but also on the questions. So I'd like to open the floor for any comments or questions at this point of time, and then we will move on to the 2 respondents before we will have the last round of questions and comments and then close this webinar. So the floor is open if you have any questions or comments at this point of time to the 4 presenters or 4 presentations that were made. Thank you. On. Are there any questions at this point? Okay, is it correct that I don't see any? Oh yeah. Frank, do you have a question? Frank Tate from SynBioBeta. Paxton or Lewis, can you help? Because I'm not able to really pick up if there is any hand for any question to be asked.
Bala, this is Paxson. I think if somebody has a question, they can raise their hands. There is the icon for the hand. You can raise your hand, and all attendees are muted. So if you have a question, we need to see you. Please raise your hand, and then we can unmute you. Over to Bala.
Thank you, Paxton. So if you have any question, raise the hand button in the attendees column. Okay. I hope there are no technical issues for colleagues to ask any questions.
I can see Lillian has raised her hand, so I'm going to unmute her.
Go ahead. Sure.
Lillian, please unmute yourself.
Thank you very much for the presentation. Unfortunately, I was not able to listen to the first presentation. So I just wanted to find out from the presenters if they compare the other technologies to synthetic biology. What are the advantages maybe, and also the disadvantages and the challenges encountered so far with synthetic biology? Thank you.
Thank you, Lillian. We'll take one more question. I see 2 Lillians, Lillian Chimpepo and Lillian For.
I'm going to unmute Lillian For so she can go ahead and ask her question.
Sure.
It's the same. Maybe I opened several.
Okay.
Oh,
perfect. Okay. Any more questions? Okay, I don't see none. So maybe anyone from the panel can answer the question or comment raised by Lillian. Feel free to comment. Felicity, Mathias, Mikhail, Nicole. Any one of you would like to respond? Yes, Nicole. No, not yet. Still can't hear you.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay,
go ahead.
Great. That's a great question, and I want to just give one example, because I love examples of has synthetic, and how does synthetic biology compare to some of the other technologies? And so one of the examples that I think is interesting and representative of a lot of cases is from the remediation side. So there's a chemical called PFAS, which many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with. It's also called forever chemicals. They're perfluorinated compounds, and they're used in things like Teflon and firefighting foams. And they've been used for decades, and they're great in terms of the technology that they've enabled, but they have also been pervasive in our land and waterways to the point where polar bears in the Arctic have been found to have PFAS in their systems. The technology that exists today does a good job of sequestering PFAS from our water. So you can use technology that exists today, but then once you sequester that PFAS, you have a concentrated solution that then gets landfilled or incinerated in most cases today. So a lot of times, synthetic biology can be used where there is no other good solution and no other technology exists. So in this case, synthetic biology is being developed to break down that compound and render it inert. So you don't have to incinerate it and you don't have to landfill it, which then has the cycle going where it goes back into our land and water. So I think there are a lot of advantages of biology can enable that's just not possible with some of those other solutions. And I think that, you know, in a lot of the areas that are being developed today, that's possible. Michael can probably talk on the material side of things, but on the remediation side, I think that that's exciting and possible. And just very quickly on the limitations, you know, biology and synthetic biology in these applications is hard to develop, and probably a lot of people on the call already know this, but it takes a long time, and it's difficult to develop, and it can take years. And again, kind of to the point of this call too, we have to look at what are the regulation hurdles that come along with that. So Michael, I'll turn it over to you.
Go to you, Mika. Michael, you want to respond? Okay. Mikhail. Mikhail, do you want to respond to that question? No, for some reason we can't hear Mikhail. Okay, fine. So we have another question from Desiderio Niamongo. Please go ahead, Desiderio Niamongo.
Thank you, Chair.
Go ahead.
My question is thank you. Are you able to hear me?
Yes, please go ahead.
Thank you. My question is to Michael, and it's about the technology he presented in terms of sequestering the atmospheric, the greenhouse gases, sequestering carbon dioxide. The technology that sequester carbon dioxide. It sounded quite revolutionary. Just wondering what this portends for the future. Are we looking at a future where we are then able to sequester the greenhouse gases and perhaps overcome the challenges of climate change? Thank you, Chair.
Yes, very good question. I hope you can hear me now. Apologies, I couldn't unmute before.
Go ahead. Go ahead, Mika.
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of potential there. I think our process essentially can take various industrial emissions. So that's, for example, steel industry, other heavy industry. You could also think about cement plants. I think that those are things that those are kind of hard to decarbonize industry sectors and industries that were kind of required, but at the moment I think there's no solutions to use those gases. So I think those industries together, also I think, for example, aviation accounts for 30% of our CO2 emissions. So I think essentially with a technology like ours and other technologies, I think if you can use those emissions as a feedstock, and then for manufacturing, I think then you have a lot of potentials there. A lot of quantities. Our technology also allows to use CO2. So I think, for example, with green hydrogen. So I think you can, for example, also imagine to use the technology together with direct air capture or other sources of CO2. And we can also feed into the technology municipal solid waste that otherwise cannot be recycled, that can be gasified and feed into the technology. So there's a lot of ways, a lot of feedstock opportunities. So I think our first process, I think, makes ethanol. So there's those limited amounts of or limited market for ethanol. So I think we can through also coupling that with catalysis and upgrade that to jet fuel to make other products like polyethylene from that. But it's important, I think, to expand the technology to make other products. I think we've demonstrated acetone and isopropanol. In fact, we demonstrated over 100 different molecules we can make. So I think that it takes time to develop those, but certainly then also I think really important is that we can roll that out quickly and switch. So biology enables to switch strains. So I think we can, for example, go from ethanol production to acetone production or to isopropanol production, depending on the needs. So I think it can be on-demand manufacturing. But certainly the regulations there to import strains and approval of strains is, I think, a key factor there. That's and the speed of which those approvals can be obtained is I think, important for rolling out the technology. Maybe adding to Nicole there on the question before, which is somewhat related on the manufacturing side. So I think synthetic biology certainly has the opportunity to make some products that are the same like traditionally produced products. So I think the ethanol or the acetone doesn't differentiate from fossil produced acetone or isopropanol, or in terms of the quality or any other properties. But currently, for example, acetone production results in 2.5 kilograms of CO2 produced and emitted to the atmosphere for producing 1 kilogram of acetone. Whereas with our process, we can lock in nearly 2 kilograms of CO2 into the acetone molecule itself, and then essentially avoid that being released to the atmosphere. The other advantage, of course, synthetic biology can offer is some performance advantages. So, for example, biodegradability of plastic or performance advantage materials, which I think is very exciting, and I think really something that's also can contribute a lot to kind of our plastic crisis. But as Nicole also said, I think it's these technologies are it takes time to develop these. I think we also, as the technology evolving, we're getting better and more rapid at developing these. But I think it's certainly something that's in development and takes time.
Thanks a lot, Nicole. Thank you very much. So now we will, I don't see any other hand for more questions. So we will now move on to two of our respondents on today's webinar. I'm very happy to have and invite Ms. Takazeni Shidada, who is the national focal point for the Cartagena Convention on Biosafety. She's also the Deputy Director, the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and Environment in South Africa. He's been working on issues of environmental risk assessment in GMOs for many years and sits on the GMO Executive Committee of South Africa, and also a member of the ad hoc technical expert group on synthetic biology under the Convention on Biological Diversity. Thanks a lot, Nkosini, and the floor is yours.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead. Yes, we can hear you now. Yeah, we can go ahead.
Oh, thank you so much. I just wanted to indicate that I'm currently on load shedding, so I'm just putting on my camera just to say hello, and then I will switch it off just to manage my data bundle. Yeah, today there has been some exciting event, particularly for myself as a regulator, and we've learned a lot in terms of synthetic biology. However, got some few views that I would like to share with you, colleagues, and noting that synthetic biology has been considered as an emerging technology with the potentials to various fields, and in many countries like mine, we've also developed a bioeconomy strategy which also identify the potential benefits associated with synthetic biology, and also it's also viewed as a technology that has an opportunity to unlock the economy, as well as to address some national development agenda. However, the synthetic biology it's currently being subjected to some unique potential and institutional factors that might impede the embracing of the technology. I guess this is a challenge to many developing countries, and therefore, in my own view, I feel that it is very important that we need to develop a good governance of synthetic biology, and that might be caused by the fact that when synthetic biology was being introduced in a global agenda, it was introduced as an emerging technology, and that provides uncertainties amongst the regulators as whether it falls within the current scope of regulatory framework, particularly at a national level. So I was also impressed with the fact that our colleague Michael, as he was showing some of the future developments on the field of biotechnology, how he also showed some interesting projects, including the addressing some of the triple challenges, which include climate change. However, it was disheartening to see that in all fairness, I couldn't see anything from the Africa region in terms of the future consideration of projects, and that really indicates that we're still inundated with capacity constraints and the uptake of the technology in order for us to realize our development agenda. And in other essence, I feel like we still have a way to go, particularly to address some of the aspects in terms of synthetic biology in the context of policy development and regulatory systems, noting that there was a consideration in the previous COP decision that synthetic biology organisms may be the same as those organisms that are considered under the Catena Protocol on biosafety, and that also provided an uncertainties in terms of the regulatory systems, and therefore noting that many countries have the national biosafety frameworks, but some are not currently functional, and that will create some challenges in terms of the uptake of the technology. And then as a message for today, I feel like it's very important that we need to consider capacity building initiatives under synthetic biology, particularly for regulators. This will really assist in terms of speeding up the uptake of the technology. I also feel that there is lots of opportunities for synthetic biology in terms of addressing our development agendas. Therefore, when we are considering the post-2020 global biodiversity framework, we need to ensure that issues and elements of synthetic biology, including the benefits associated with it, needs to be taken into cognizance when we are considering under the discussion of the global biodiversity framework, and also ensuring a good balance, because I feel that there is this discussion ties up with the current discussion on technology transfer and capacity development, and there is merit on that, and we also need to take cognizance of that, of the fact. And the issue of awareness raising remains to be important for in our discussion. With that, I'm quite privileged to be part of the panelists, and I thank you with those words. Thank you.
Thank you, Lakaseni. Thank you very much for your comments. Certainly, very valid points that you raised, which certainly is a reflection of the ongoing discussions both within the ad hoc technical expert group as well as the discussions under the convention, the protocols and the related processes. And of course, I can certainly echo the concern you have of what we call as the distribution of investments, which Mathias had mentioned when he was making his intervention, that there's been very uneven investments that have been happening across continents and countries. But certainly a couple of points that you mentioned in terms of the need for better clarity among the policymakers, the regulators and negotiators at the convention, considering the benefits as well as very carefully looking at the national situations, both in terms of availability of technology, the technology transfer options, and the capacity development issues and related to that. So thank you very much, Kazini, and hold on, we may have a few questions from the participants. Then I'd like to invite Sachin Satyarajan, who currently is with the National Law School of India University, based in Bangalore in India. Sachin has been working on the issue of synthetic biology for quite some time now, and he worked with me in developing a foresight paper for Government of India on synthetic biology a couple of years ago. And currently, Sachin is also focusing on issues of how different institutions and policy frameworks have an interplay on issues related to synthetic biology. Over to you, Sachin.
Yes, so am I audible?
Yes, Sachin, go ahead. Yes, go ahead.
Yes. Okay. So, we saw from all these talks earlier and been very informative on what are the benefits of synthetic biology. So we saw environmental management, human health, energy, agriculture, and biofuels. And also there was also Mathias talking about future applications of synthetic biology like archival storage, improve conservation, climate change solutions, etc. Right? So it's clear that there's a range of benefits that synthetic biology comes with. At the same time, there was also talk about unintended consequences during Matthew's talk. So like environmental consequences, and if we use a little bit of our imagination, bioterrorism, loss of future trade opportunities, transboundary harm. So we see that like every other fourth industrial revolution technology, synthetic biology comes with highly polarized debates on the risks and benefits associated to the technology. And this polarization is largely due to the large degree of scientific uncertainty that surrounds the emerging technology. My background is in international law, so I will start with some of the broad issues in policy and regulation surrounding synthetic biology. And in the second part of my talk, if I have time, I will be able to focus on some of those different international policy regimes which are being impacted by the developments in synthetic biology. So it is obvious that any technology cannot advance without some freedom in research and development. So the challenge as policymakers and regulators is to see how we can maximize benefits while guarding against potential risks. So what we have in place currently is the laws and regulations governing traditional tools and products of biotechnology. And in some ways, some of these frameworks are still applicable to this relatively new field of synthetic biology. But most policymakers are of this opinion that the traditional framework in place will not be able to fully capture the evolving possibilities of synthetic biology. And among academics and policy perspective, we see that the framework, what is needed is anticipatory governance, a set of procedural principles that we can create by collectively imagining and deliberating over the possibilities of development of the technology in the future. When we talk about the risks, I think Felicity had already started with the background on the Cartagena Protocol. So on a spectrum of risks, we are looking at, on one hand, an intentional bioterrorist attack to accidental damage to the environment on the other. So the difference is intention. So if we are talking about biosafety issues, those are accidental events because the inherent risks of using a biological agent or material to cause any sort of unintentional harm to human health and environment is covered by biosafety. And on the other hand, there are biosecurity issues, which is intentional use of biological agents that can have tremendous security implications. So one example we can think of is the 2001 anthrax attacks in the United States, where we understood the possible risks of mishandling of pathogens. We also have the Biological Weapons Convention, which prohibits the development or acquiring of biological agents for hostile purposes or armed conflict. And from a public health perspective, we have the WHO international health regulations, which, and then, in the light of the current pandemic, we see that there's increased securitization of public health. And this is important in a scenario where production and mailing of DNA parts, including that of smallpox, was completely legal. And we saw examples like in 2011, where two scientists alarmed the world by revealing they had separately modified the avian influenza virus so that it can easily spread between ferrets. So all these issues, and combined with the threat of new global outbreaks, biosecurity issues are a huge part of policy governance on synthetic biology. But what is more relevant to today's conversation are biosafety issues. Felicity had already talked about the Cartagena Protocol, how it deals with the import and export of LMOs, including illegal and unintentional transboundary movements. The Cartagena Protocol will apply to most synthetic biology organisms, and the framework will be relevant for its governance. Another treaty which is going to be significant for biosafety is the Sanitary and Phytosanitary Measures Agreement, the SPS Agreement, which is administered by the World Trade Organization, which looks into considerations of food safety and plant and animal health. So Cartagena Protocol is ratified by almost 171 countries, and many of them have in place national biosafety regulations, which has to be followed by synthetic biology manufacturers. And there are some 131 countries with national laws specifically addressing risk assessment and management. But one of the major issues is that major technology players such as the United States, Canada, and Argentina are not parties to the protocol. So this is a short overview of the risk management when it comes to synthetic biology. And there is another aspect of it is regulating the benefits, because synthetic biology products are likely to attract protection through intellectual property rights. And these proprietary models offer an exclusive set of rights for the intellectual property holders and any third party who wants to exercise any of these commercial rights, they have to get a permission or license from the IP holder. And there are several issues which govern, which just with respect to the regulation of benefits. So one important aspect is patents in living organisms and ownership in living organisms. So we have, a couple of questions when it comes to patents and ownership. Firstly, what is the criteria for a valid patent on living inventions such as synthetic biology organisms? Can genes and living organisms constitute patentable subject matter? Secondly, there has been a debate on how the patent holder can exercise exclusive rights. So can a patent holder withhold the technology and give away exclusive license to a few parties? So these are important questions when it comes to the management of synthetic biology organisms. Another important factor is copyright and open innovation. So private sector entities tend to be pro-IP, and access to synthetic biology tools, whether it is going to be through an open source model or an open innovation model where everybody will be able to access these synthetic biology tools, is another major question. A third aspect, which was already covered, is access and benefit sharing. And access and benefit sharing issues are very vital for conservation efforts for different countries. To wind up my talk, I'll also talk about different other treaties other than the Convention on Biological Diversity, where synthetic biology is a major topic. So when it comes to public health, the World Health Organization, when it comes to trade in SBOs, when you have the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, which is the CITES Convention. When it comes to health and food security, we have the Bioweapons Convention. The World Intellectual Property Organization is looking into aspects of genetic resources, traditional knowledge, and folklore. We have the Food and Agricultural Organization administered international treaty on plant genetic resources for food and agriculture, which looks at issues of food security. The UN Convention on the Law of Sea, which addresses issues on marine genetic resources in areas beyond national jurisdiction. And finally, the World Trade Agreement on trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights, which looks at IPR issues with respect to synthetic biology. So these are the major, some of the major international governance regimes which are impacted by synthetic biology. And that will be the end of my talk. Thank you. I'm open to
thank you,
Sachin.
Yeah, thank you, Sachin, and quite an exhaustive list of different processes under which some of these issues are being discussed. But of course, one key takeaway from your presentation, or the points or the comments you made, is the need for discussions under the convention. To an extent, all of these are considered, but to have a better and an in-depth understanding of the different discussions, under the different processes, but also the emerging policy debates within these different institutions and governance frameworks that are important for the parties to the Convention on Biological Diversity to consider as and when decisions are being made in the context of the convention. And of course, it does make things a little complicated because there are so many of these issues discussed on various components in various different settings. I mean, you mentioned a number of them, the Food and Agriculture Organization, CITES, UNCLOS, the World Trade Organization related, TRIPS related aspects and all that. So it's very important that we consider to an extent all of these, because developments under each of these would certainly have an impact to an extent on the policy and the regulatory discussions that will happen in the Convention on Biological Diversity. And of course, the ATEC, the Ad Hoc Technical Expert Group, as well as the discussions under the convention would consider some of it. But it is important also for countries at the national level to look at what their national interests are in terms of various processes that are ongoing, and consolidate their interventions as they input into these discussions that are happening through various platforms. So thanks a lot, Sachin. And we will now open the floor for questions or comments, not just on the respondents' presentation, but also on the overall elements of the webinar. The floor is open for any questions or comments you may have. Please raise your hand so that we will give you the microphone. Are there any questions? Comments and inputs? Right. I'm just trying to scroll and see if you have any hands up. No? Okay. Colleagues, in case if there are no questions or comments. Jagdish, me too, Jagdish. Jagdish, yes. Yeah, Paxton, you can unmute microphone for me too, Jagdish.
Okay, thank you so much. Unfortunately, I could not participate in the earlier part of today's discussion. Just a general question in terms of enabling what we've discussed to move forward. I'm just wondering what has been the effort in terms of keeping the decision-making authorities in loop as well. For example, in Karnataka, the departments relevant to the subject we are talking about, also in other countries, what's happening in regards to keeping decision-making authorities in the loop.
Okay. I mean, I can attempt to answer that question, but maybe I'll first ask if there is anyone from the panel who would like to answer, but otherwise I can go ahead and then maybe colleagues can jump in. Certainly, Jagdish, the context of the discussion is for us to understand various developments, both in terms of science and applications of synthetic biology. Yeah. And the platform within which a lot of these discussions are happening for decision making is the Convention on Biological Diversity. And I'm sure you're familiar with all the discussions and you've been a part of these discussions in India and all that. So the way it actually normally unfolds is that many of these discussions and negotiations and decisions happen at the global level. But then the 196 countries that are parties to the convention have an obligation to implement those decisions or to realize those decisions at the national level. So the participation and the information sharing that happens at the national level is the responsibility of the focal points, the national focal points. For example, we had our colleague Nakasini Shirada from South Africa, who is the national focal for biosafety. So what happens is that the national biosafety focal points or the Kaitahana focal points, they actually in turn are to an extent involved in disseminating the outcomes and also seeking any inputs and also ensuring that at the state level or provincial level, whatever discussions happen are tied into the national positions that get presented during these negotiations that happen at the level of COP. So in terms of your question, having been familiar with what's happening in India and Karnataka, you mentioned, is that it's the national focal point for biosafety within Government of India who should be a consolidator of these interests, aspirations, and priorities coming from different provinces or states that gets reflected at the global discussions that happen. Okay. I hope I have answered your question.
I think so. It's just just going back to a parallel when the institutions and the companies relevant to, let's say, genetically modified crops, there's so much of talks going on, so much of information flow is going on, but unfortunately, a proper connect we will never get made if we do not to the decision-making authority. Finally, we have to depend on government authorities to give us permission to do whatever we need to do, even for trials. So now, if we don't engage some of these people right from the start, I think we will keep running into stumbling blocks, and how we going to go over those hurdles, I think it will be a big challenge. I'm just using our India as an example, and It may not be the case in other countries, but I just want to make sure that the relevant departments are in the loop right from the beginning, even for webinars like this. I hope some government officials are also present, so they know exactly what's going on at the global level, and now when it gets transferred to transition to national level, and then to the state level, and there's a long distance to travel. So somehow we need to come up with a mechanism of information flow, and then some sort of a guidance, from the global level almost to the state level. Thank you, Bala.
Thanks, Jagdish. Valid point. And the very purpose of organizing this kind of a webinar, UNEP is organizing it, is just to bridge that gap.
Yeah.
Because as you have heard, that we have industry and we have academia experts working on these issues from an application viewpoint. On the other hand, we have the focal points, the regulators and the policymakers who are discussing on how to deal with the issue of policy and regulatory frameworks. But to an extent, there is a need for better communication between these two groups. It is not that they are not communicating, but to an extent, it's very informal. It is very much on the sidelines, but it is still not mainstreamed. For example, whatever points that Sachin made in terms of the different processes, it is very important that whether it is at the global level or national level, some of these discussions get connected. So this webinar and the one that we follow up on the 8th of March is just an attempt to bridge that gap. But you are right, we do have a long distance to go in terms of bridging it at the national level, but also at the global level to an extent. And we hope to keep this kind of a discussion going more frequently in the weeks and months to come. Thanks, Jagdish.
Just one more comment before, if it's okay. And then, like, see, the decision-making authorities in the governments always depend on public opinion. And we need to be continuously reaching out to public in multiple languages, in multiple forms, from some simple basics to the most complicated ones, so that public opinion is towards what are the benefits of synthetic biology, so that when government officials go out talking about it, then they know that they have support from the public as well. I'll end there. Thank you.
Sure. No, agreed. Communication is very key, and we have sort of learned a lot of lessons on issues related to GMOs and communications, and we still are having a lot of challenges in that space. So thanks a lot, Jagdish. I see a few more hands. I'll give to Tim Strabala from New Zealand. Tim, over to you.
Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead, Tim.
Okay, great. Thank you, Bala. I'll just say to Mitu before I actually ask my question that yes, there are government officials and regulators in attendance tonight. We, in terms of what you said about getting people involved early, I fully agree. We tend to tell our applicant pool, stakeholder pool, that if they want to do an application with us, please contact us as early as possible. One of the reasons for this is, and this leads to my question to Sachin, is that New Zealand law actually requires that we take the considerations and views and well-being of Maori, the indigenous population of New Zealand, into account in our decision-making, and we are working more and more towards actual consultation with Maori in relation to not only their indigenous knowledge, or their matoranga as it's called, but in terms of what their views are on a particular process that people are working on. Especially Maori in the area where this work might be done. So my question to Sachin, though, was about you mentioned the WIPO is looking into indigenous knowledge and traditional resources and folklore. I was wondering what the end, what WIPO was planning, where they see the end point of this work being, because I think that would be of great interest here in New Zealand to Maori. So that would be useful information. Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe since you have a direct question to Sachin, maybe I'll let Sachin answer, and then I'll give the floor to both Dr. Murali and Dr. Sangeeta, who have raised their hands. Sachin, over to you quickly, please.
The WIPO, am I audible?
Yes, go ahead, Sachin.
I believe the last meeting of the committee of the The Intergovernmental Committee of the WIPO was held in August 2021, and they recommended the mandate of the committee be renewed for the 2022-23 biennium. And what I've followed so far is that any international instrument adopted pursuant to the ICG process will likely have potential implications for the Convention on Biological Diversity also, particularly with respect to its third objective concerning benefit sharing, which is the objectives underlined in the CBD Nagoya Protocol. The IGC negotiation so far has addressed genetic resources, and I was fortunate to work with Pedro Rofe in 2017 when he was the chair of the WIPO IGC, where the Earth Bank, the Amazonian project on sequencing all the eukaryotic organisms was flagged in the WIPO IGC, and the implications of the DSI which was generated from these NGS projects and its potential synthetic biology applications was addressed on the floor of the World Intellectual Property Organization, where synthetic biology was formally debated by the WIPO IGC. But WIPO IGC seems more of a political process which is taking much more time than it was established as far behind in 2000, and it is 2022, and we still do not have anything binding which has come out of the WIPO IGC, I'm afraid.
Thank you, Sachin. Dr. Sangeeta? Action, can you give the floor to Dr. Sangeeta Kasturi?
Yes,
Yeah,
can you
ahead,
hear me?
Yeah. Yes, go ahead.
Thank you, Dr. Balakrishnan. And this is, I'm sorry I joined little late, but this is very important discussions going, and I could hear some of the presentations also, very interesting presentations. And as you know, we have already done the study, the National Consultation Program, and developed the foresight paper on synthetic biology, and many aspects have come up on that. What is needed is for India, basically from the academia, researchers, and from private sector. So these are very useful recommendations we have got from the policy perspective, and we would be taking forward. Again, this is going to be doing larger consultation we are going to do for the national consultation for this report. And as I understand from the global perspective, it's very important that we need to have the, again, definition. We are coming back to the synthetic biology definition, which is universally accepted, and we don't have to go again for the policy. Within the existing policy, how we can include the synthetic biology and what are the regulations with respect to its adverse or impact on the biodiversity and the human environment, etc. So there is need for the harmony and synergy between the national and international fora. So I'm sure these discussions would be very helpful to be debated, and you are doing very fantastic work. And we would be happy to have this recommendation coming up if DBT can take forward for some discussion with respect to the national policy. So with this, I would pause and thank you for the opportunity. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Sangeeta. Thank you very much. As you mentioned, that India does have the basis for a policy framework that I'm happy to know that you're planning to take it forward. So certainly, yes, keep tuned, and we'll sort of keep you informed as things happen at the global level. Dr. Murali, raise your hand up. Go ahead, Dr. Murali. Dr. Murali, you can go ahead. Dr. Murali, we are not able to hear you.
Able to hear me now?
Yeah. Yes, please go ahead.
Okay, so Dr. Bala, thank you for organizing and also giving me an opportunity. See, as some of you know that I have been in the advocacy part of doing this, including associated with crop life in the early parts. So one of the layers that you may like to add, besides the government officials, regulators, industry and academia, and also the general public for swinging policies, is that we may need to also engage quite often with the key opinion leaders in political parties, because a lot many times we fall on account of the will of the government not being there to carry through something that all the technical experts and people in general feel it's fine, let's go ahead, but it doesn't go through. So that is something that we need to keep in mind. I'm not seeing that much of engagement with the political class, largely because I think academicians and the others may stay away, but I think that's one layer that you may like to look at. My second point is, I don't know how much relevant it is to this area, but I still thought I will put it across because it is synthetic biology, is that we are going to have quite a new set of developments coming up in the years to come. It's going to be more on the live biotherapeutics. They are going to be one class of organisms that are going to be engineered and sent back to the different organs of the body. And they will be playing a far-reaching role in terms of what they intelligently do there. And also the microbial cell factories or live pharmacies, etc., etc. So we may need to keep an eye on that to see how that pans out into the future. It's going to be available in the next 5 to 7 years. So I just thought I'll record these two statements for this forum. Thanks, Bala. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. Only well noted on the need for engagement with political leaders and influencers. So certainly that's point well taken. So now that I don't see any further hands up, maybe I'll give a floor to all our panelists and respondents for just a minute of wrap-up comments or any points that they would like to reflect or add to the discussions we have so far. So we'll start with Mikhail. Just 1 minute each, please. Mikhail, over to you.
Sure. So I think, this dialogue is, really useful. I think it's something that I hope to continue and I think include additional viewpoints. I think obviously we have four panelists here, but I think representing some area of industry, but I think there's a lot of development going on. So I think that's something that's I think really important. Certainly, I think synthetic biology has been, exciting advances. I think there's the technology can make a lot of positive impact in climate change, in bioremediation, in obviously I think in the health sector, with I think the RNA vaccines and I think other areas. So and I think it's really important, I think, to have clear and transparent policies in place and regulation. I think we certainly have a framework in place. I think there's certainly areas for streamlining. And as I mentioned, I think especially on the kind of use of contained microbes is maybe very different from multicellular organisms, which maybe historically been with kind of native animals and plants export, where a lot of the policies originally have been derived. So I think that's certainly something that's to be considered as well. But I guess I have probably my minute.
Thank you. Thanks, Mikhail. Nicole?
Hi, thank you. Yes, I think this was a really interesting conversation, and one of the things that I took away from this is there's a lot of good thought leadership and experience in this area that companies like Allonnia and others that are developing synthetic biology solutions can tap into and really help understand what those guardrails are that we need to be aware of, what's been done in other industries, like what Patricia talked about, and what we can bring to these solutions. But synthetic biology is really, I truly believe, the new frontier for environmental solutions, and having these conversations and working together to safely bring this technology to the problems that we have today, I think is going to be very powerful. So thank you.
Thanks, Nicole. Mathias? Go ahead, Mathias. Yes. Go ahead. Go ahead.
It's working now.
Yes.
All right. Hi, everybody. I think a very interesting panel, and thanks everyone for contributing. It seems that, and I think we touched on synthetic biology, not just as, a way to replace technology that's polluting, but also to create new growth, for the economy. I think we touched on the need to make sure that that growth is applied, equitably, I guess, as much as that's possible. But I also think there is a real opportunity for developing nations with this set of technologies. And then, I think, as Michael said, definitely regulations are going to be needed. And I think some level of clarity, it seems to be already a fairly complex regulatory framework, and I'd love to hear more on the next webinar on where that regulation, that set of regulations is going, to make sure that the field can continue growing and deliver on its promise. So thank you very much, all.
Thanks, Mathias. Yeah. So I'll now give the floor to Felicity, but panelists and respondents stay on. We'll have a quick photos opportunity once we finish all the comments and switch your cameras on. But over to you, Felicity.
Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes,
So from my side, from my side, it was informative to hear about examples of microbial applications. From in the synthetic biology discussions under the convention, there's been a lot of focus on larger organisms, so crops, animals, gene drives. And also Michael mentioned regulation in place in countries where they are operating, and which was a take-home message for me. In these discussions under the convention and also under the Cartagena Protocol, there have been questions about the existence of this. Does it exist? Is it adequate? What's it based on? Does there need to be new rules? So this is for these types of uses in containment, or even in like in the environment, in like a pod, like a contained or confined setting. So this is really valuable information and expertise to contribute to these synthetic biology discussions.
Thank you, Felicity. Nakatsini? Nakatsini, are you there? Okay, maybe we'll go to Sachin and then come back to her. Please go ahead, Sachin.
Thank you, Bala. From today's panel and the experts that have come to share their views, we see that there's a lot of interest in synthetic biology. The sector is attracting a lot of investment, and there's a lot of creativity happening in the industry. my talk mostly focused on broader policy issues and its impact on international legal and governance regimes. But something I want to leave the audience with is to also understand that there is a lot of self-governance that is happening from the industry perspective, and the industry has been taking adopting a lot of soft standards which facilitate responsible behavior, because a lot of industry feels that government agencies are equipped in understanding the complexities of the technologies and the organization of the industry. So I think one question I want to leave the audience with is to see that whether self-governance by the industry can be good enough to regulate synthetic biology, or should we broaden our horizons when it comes to international legal regimes.
Thank you, Sachin. So you're just leaving us with a question to think. Is self-governance by the industry a good starting point, awaiting more formal frameworks or decisions made by the member states or parties to the convention? It's a good point to make. I just would like to check if Nakasini would like to make any comments. Otherwise, I'd request all the panelists to switch on your cameras so that we can quickly take a snap, and then we can close the webinar. Yes, Nicole, Felicity, and Cousin. Matias. Good. Oh yeah, perfect. Matias and Felicity. Are you there, Felicity? Nakasini?
I am here, but this is Felicity, but my webcam will not work, sorry.
Okay, fine. It's okay. Yeah, that's perfectly fine. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, colleagues, and thank you very much for your insightful comments and inputs into this webinar. As I mentioned, that we will reconvene on the 8th of March, where we'll focus on the issues of policy and regulatory developments in synthetic biology. Like what we had now, we'll have 4 experts speaking about the recent developments, and 2 respondents who will also be reflecting from the industry and the academic perspective. And of course, as I mentioned, that we will compile a few key points from this webinar and the forthcoming webinar into a short report that we'll submit to the convention on biological diversity for consideration for discussions and negotiations on issues related to synthetic biology. But from UNAP, we will continue to engage with some of these processes and some of these kinds of ideas that we have shared today in terms of pushing the science policy interface aspects much better. And as I mentioned, that it's a great example and a starting point when we are celebrating 50 years of UNAP in 2022. So thank you very much for your inputs. And certainly I'd like to thank SynBio Beta colleagues and also Mathias from Deloitte and all those who actually have joined us in organizing this particular webinar. So I hope to see all of you, several of you on 8th of March. Thank you very much and have a great day. And thanks to my colleagues, Paxson and Louis, who actually are working at the backgrounds to pull this entire thing together. So thanks, Louis, thanks, Paxson and Ladu and colleagues. So until see you on 8th of March. Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a great one. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.